Hello, I hope you're all doing well. This is a character creator for a game I've been working on, and I plan to make a devlog for my game within the next few weeks. As you can see, I'm able to change the character's hair, face, shirt, and the rest of the clothing. There's also a button in which I can randomize the player's look. Character customization is a huge part in many games, and this allows players to feel like they're undergoing their own story rather than just following along an already built storyline. The way I was able to do this is by using Composite Sprites, which basically means to keep separate sprite sheets for different components and then layer them on to create a final image. I'll go over how I made something like this. I'll be using a pixel editing software called Sprite, which I highly recommend, and I'll also use the Godot game engine. You can use any software of your choosing to follow along, as it's the concept that's important, not necessarily what you use. So here in Sprite, I have my character drawn in several different layers. I always start with the base body first, and then I add the arms on a separate layer. It's useful to have the arms on a separate layer because it can allow for situations such as holding items which should be rendered behind the arms and in front of the body. Then I proceed to draw the rest of the components such as the hair and clothing on separate layers. The benefit of doing this is that it allows you to easily create new hairstyles or clothing rather quickly than just redrawing the whole sprite. Once I have all the layers completed, I export each layer into a sprite sheet of its own. Once you have all the sprite sheets saved in a PNG format, add it to your project directory. Within Godot, let's create a new scene for our customizable character. Let's create a node 2D, then rename it to player. Ctrl S to save the scene. Now let's add a child node to hold all of the sprites we'll be working with. We'll call it Composite Sprites. And then let's add several sprites as children of that node. Each sprite node will correspond to a layer we created previously. Now for each sprite, we can add a sprite sheet, but it's not necessary because we'll be using code to change the textures. Also, make sure to set the h-frames property to however many frames there are in the sprite sheet. In my case, I have 8 for the idle animation. Do this for all the sprite nodes. Now let's add a script to the player node. Click create. And now let's get rid of all this stuff. So now let's create onReady vars to access all of our sprite nodes. And in this way, we can change the texture for each sprite with code. Now let's just add a ready function temporarily to our script. I'll add a new script to the project called Composite Sprites so I can preload all the sprite sheets in this file and reference it from our player node. Here I'll create a dictionary for each layer where the key value would be an index and the value would be the sprite sheet texture. I'll do this for all the layers. Back in the player script, I'll preload the script that we just made so we have access to the sprite sheets. Now in the ready function, we'll set the sprites to an arbitrary sprite sheet from our Composite Sprites variable. Now within the 2D view, let's move the player's position towards the center so we can see him. Cool. Now let's just adjust the scale a bit higher so we see our character clearer. Just like that. Click play. Great. Now let's add a button so we are able to switch the sprite for our hair. Just a normal button will work just fine. Create it. And I'll rename this to change hair. I'll go to the node tab and then I'll create a signal for the pressed action. Now within the player script, let's create variables to keep track of the current hair and also for the other sprites. These will be integers and they will correspond to the key of the sprite sheet dictionary that we created previously. Now within the change hair signal, let's update the current hair index. I want the index to wrap around and not go out of bounds. So I'll make sure to modulo it by the total amount of hairstyles we have. And we can do this simply by just calling the size function on the sprite sheets dictionary. And let's make sure to update the hair sprites texture. Now let's click play and check it out. Great, so each button press will swap through each of the hairstyles that we set. So now I'll just quickly create buttons for the rest of the layers that I created, and I'll just quickly fast forward through this part. So this is the completed signal functions. And I've also rearranged the buttons in this manner. Well, it's pretty arbitrary, but now let's click play. And now this button changes the face, this changes the shirt, this changes the hair, the accessories, shoes, and the pants. Great. Now let's create a button to randomize everything. So I'll create a button node again, and I'll rename it to Randomize button. I'll give it the name Randomize. Actually, yeah, it doesn't resize. So let me just rename it to something shorter. I'll just call it Rand. Great, okay. So now I can fit it into the screen. And now in the node tab, I'll also create a signal for the pressed action, and I'll add it to the player script. Now here, at the top of the player script, I'm going to create a variable called RNG, and I'll create a random number generator. And with this, I'm able to call a function called randiRange. And what randiRange does is it takes in two parameters and it'll return a randomly chosen integer between those two integers given. And what I want to do is select one from 0 to the last index of the sprite sheets. And I'll do this for all of my layers. Now let's make sure to also set the textures of the sprites. Now let's click play and then try out the random button. Great, so it works now. Looks pretty good. So that's pretty much how I created my character creator. Leave a comment below and tell me what you think. Thanks for watching and have a wonderful day or night. Take care.